Can I ask everyone to please take a seat? We'll start the program in a few moments. Please take a seat. If everyone can please find a seat. Can you hear it? It's not very loud. John? If everyone would please find a seat. Is that better? Okay. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Michael. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Royal Oak Foundation program. We're so thrilled that we have Royal Oak back with us. It's been too long, and we look forward to more programs with this great organization, one of our great partner organizations. And as you know, the Legacy Foundation partners with all kinds of organizations throughout the Philadelphia region and beyond. We provide civics education. We care for the great collections of the Union League of Philadelphia and other related collections, use them for exhibits, for tours. How many were on the monthly history tour? I know some of you were today. If you haven't gone on a monthly history tour, please make sure you go on a tour with one of our great docents. We have lots of programs, all with the same purpose, to create more engaged, better educated citizen leaders. And we do all this through your generosity, through the generosity of our donors and our members. So please, if you haven't yet made a contribution, I hope you'll consider making one to the Legacy Foundation. And we're right in that jumping off point for our annual appeal. So if you haven't seen something in the mail, you will see something very, very soon. And again, I thank you in advance for your support. A couple of housekeeping items. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. While you do that, I'll just make two commercials. One, if you don't have plans for dinner, we do have a couple of spots available, more than a few, upstairs with Lord and Lady Sackville, and we hope you'll join us. And you can look for Kristen Moran. Kristen, give them a wave. She'll be up in the library lounge, and please just go up to the library lounge on the second floor if you'd like to join for dinner. My other announcement, commercial of sorts, will be that our next program is Monday. We have another great British historian with us, Mr. Sir Andrew Roberts, and David Petraeus, General Petraeus, on a brand new book. It's a really wonderful book, getting great reviews on war from 1945 to Ukraine. So please go online or see our staff, and you can sign up for that. Our program tonight, we will have Q&A. We will be using the microphones so that people can hear it on our streaming, so please use the microphones. And as always, remember, it's a question, 2 or 3 sentences. If you can't put a question mark on the end of that, you failed. And our crack AV staff will shut you off after about 30 seconds, so we're looking for questions. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Royal Oak Foundation, Mr. Ian Murray. Ian.
Good evening. Let me see if I can adjust that. Is that a little better? Can you hear me? Okay, good. Well, thank you. Thank you for tonight for having us, and thank you for that introduction. I'd like to welcome Royal Oak supporters and members of the Union League who are joining us tonight. For those of you who may not know, the Royal Oak Foundation is the American membership affiliate of the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Royal Oak seeks to raise funds and advance the important work of the National Trust, preserving the past for the future. Our lectures unite fellow Anglophiles as we try to highlight the best and most recent scholarship on art and architecture, history, and social history. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Union League Legacy Foundation, who's invited us to have this lecture tonight. We've partnered on lectures since 2000, when a Royal Oak member with whom you may be familiar, Jim Mundy, suggested that we might want to host a lecture here. Since that time, we've had 275 lectures. And I want to thank everyone at Royal Oak. Really wants to thank the folks here who helped us, namely Kira, Jessica, Madeline, and Jim. I'd like to also express my deep gratitude to Mark Piggott, who is the primary underwriter for Royal Oak Lectures, as well as the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation, who've provided additional support. It's not very often that I'm able to introduce one of the family members associated with one of England's oldest and biggest country houses. So I'm delighted to welcome Robert Sackville-West, 7th Baron Sackville, who is the guardian of Knole in Kent. Lord Sackville's family has inhabited Knole, an English calendar house, so called because it has reportedly 365 rooms, for over 400 years. Lord Sackville is also an author and publisher, as well as a Royal Oak board member. He read history at Oxford and later gained an MBA at the London Business School. In 1984, he founded the publishing company Toucan Books, which publishes works on both sides of the Atlantic. He now chairs Knole Estates, the company that, in parallel with the National Trust, runs the Sackville family interests at Knole. He's the author of 2 books about his family, Inheritance, the story of Knole and the Sackvilles, and The Disinherited, a story of family, love, and betrayal. That's an interesting lecture, too. His latest book, Knole, A Private View of One of Britain's Greatest Houses, published by Rizzoli last fall, features stunning images by photographer Ashley Hicks, and they are available here if you haven't gotten one yet. The story of his family and their home is a fascinating tale, and Robert reminded me that he spoke in America over 13 years ago, starting here at the Union League. So please join me in welcoming Robert Sackville-West.
Well, it's lovely to be back in Philadelphia. As Ian has mentioned, the first talk I ever gave for the Royal Oak was here at the Union League, and such was the warmth of the welcome that I kept coming back. In her diary for July 1924, the novelist Virginia Woolf recorded a visit to Knole, where she'd just been invited to lunch with my great-uncle. Knole, she wrote, is a conglomeration of buildings, half as big as Cambridge, I dare say. But the extremities, and indeed the inward parts, are gone dead. Life has left them. I hope that by the end of this talk, illuminated by Ashley Hicks's sumptuous photographs, that you will disagree with Virginia Woolf and, like me, will have begun to love this ancient calendar house with its legendary 365 rooms, 52 staircases, and 7 courtyards. To the north of the sprawling house, as you can see in this photograph, the outbuildings, a barn, an old brew house, a granary, and workshops for carpenters, bricklayers, and painters cluster higgledy-piggledy beneath the main tower, like the yards and farm buildings of a medieval village. And yes, the origins of Knole do lie in the Middle Ages. In 1456, Thomas Bourchier, Archbishop of Canterbury, made Knole his private residence halfway between his palaces in London and at Canterbury, and he built a massive gatehouse, Bourchier's Tower, at the west end of the house. Beyond that stood the great hall and his reception rooms, apartments, and chapel. The Archbishop's chapel lies at the heart of our private apartments. This is where my father's coffin rested the night before his funeral, where my children were christened, and it's still used regularly. One of Bourchier's successors as Archbishop of Canterbury was Thomas Cranmer. King Henry VIII, however, liked Knole so much that he asked Cranmer to give it to him in 1537, and you did not argue with King Henry VIII. Henry didn't spend much time, or indeed money, at Knole. After all, he'd acquired a total of 60 royal residences by the time of his death. However, his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, did visit Knole on a royal progress in 1573, almost certainly spending the night in what is now our bedroom. It wasn't for another 30 years that the association of Knole with my family really began. In 1604, Thomas Sackville took possession of Knole and remodeled it entirely, transforming a drafty and rather ramshackle medieval mansion into a Renaissance palace. One of the things I like to do on tours of the house and in this book is to illustrate by way of a detail or close-up some poignant personal story, like this Calvary scene in the chapel. In November 1586, the aspiring courtier, Thomas Sackville, was told to break the news to Mary, Queen of Scots, that she'd been sentenced to death. So gently and compassionately did Thomas fulfill his task that she presented him with this wood carving of the procession to Calvary. Thomas Sackville rose through the ranks of the Tudor court to become Lord Treasurer, the equivalent of Secretary of the Treasury today, to both Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. Thomas wanted the world to know that his family had finally arrived, and in just 5 years of intensive building in the early 17th century, he created a great show house to celebrate his success. As children, growing up at Knole, we used to crawl through the spaces under the eaves and out onto the roofs, and here, daring each other to go just that one step further towards the edge, we would catch unexpectedly giddy views of the complex of courtyards below. We'd come right up close to those status symbols that meant so much to Thomas Sackville, 1st Earl of Dorset, the first member of the Sackville family to live at Knole. Thomas's success is shouted from the tops of the gables by 27 heraldic stone leopards. And his authority is stamped on the lead drain pipes in the form of an Earl's coronet, the Order of the Garter, and his initials TD for Thomas Dorset. Knole was built to awe and to impress. It's been a show house ever since Thomas Sackville's day, and as a result, the experience the visitor to Knole gets today is not that different from the experience that Thomas Sackville intended to give his boss and benefactor, King James I. A visitor today follows the same route as a grandee of the early 17th century. You'd sweep through a couple of vast courtyards. First, the Green Court, where Thomas created an impression of symmetry and order to the west facade by adding a two-storied bay topped with a gable to either side of Borchier's original gatehouse. Then the stone court, before processing into the great hall. Here's the oak screen at one end of the great hall at Knole. It's monstrously exuberant, a riot of weird creatures and Medusa's heads. There are heraldic beasts everywhere, including the Sackville leopard and the ram's head. The whole thing is surmounted by the Sackville coat of arms. From the great hall, you'd mount the great staircase, every surface of which is covered in painting. Climbing the stairs represented not just a social ascent towards the splendor and exclusivity of the first floor, but a spiritual one as well, a metaphor for the journey through life. As you mount the stairs, you acquire a literally heightened awareness through your experience of the five senses. In the panel facing you to the right, taste is represented by a bowl of fruit, and you can't miss the ubiquitous Sackville leopard on the newel post. The great staircase leads to the great chamber, now the ballroom, where you'd be received in state. The extraordinary marble chimney-piece, which rises the whole height of the room, was created in 1607 by Cornelius Cure, the master mason to the crown, and it ranks among the finest works of Renaissance sculpture in England. The interior decoration at Knole was, if anything, more significant than the changes that Thomas Sackville made to the outside of his house. So to imagine what the rooms actually looked like then, you simply have to strip them in your mind's eye of all the existing furniture and to furnish them sparsely instead with a few pieces of furniture and some wall hangings and tapestries for warmth and decoration. The elaborate screens, ceilings and friezes were all the decoration that Thomas Sackville needed to convey an impression of grandeur and refinement. And we're all very grateful at Knole to the Royal Oak Foundation for their generous contribution to the restoration of this particular room. From the great chamber, you'd make your way along a parade of withdrawing rooms and long galleries to one of the principal bedroom suites. And here is one of those galleries, the Cartoon Gallery. One of the revelations to me of this book and of Ashley's photographs is that they capture the richly painted and textured surfaces of the house so well. The ornately carved grotesques, the birds, monkeys, garlands of fruits and flowers, and of course the ram's head. The Cartoon Gallery culminates in the King's Room. As the name suggests, this bedchamber was designed to accommodate King James I should he visit Knole. By the time of his death in 1608, however, Thomas's remodelling of Knole was barely complete, and James I never did come to the house in whose honour the works had been undertaken. The house was already almost out of date and certainly far too big. By the mid-17th century, the family had withdrawn to private apartments on the ground floor and tended to live there rather than in the more formal public rooms on the first floor, today's exhibition rooms. These apartments are where we now live. Since moving into Knole in 2008, I've taken hundreds of people on private tours of the house, both around the showrooms and around those areas, including our apartments that are not generally open to the public. This talk, and indeed the book itself, is an introduction to those hidden areas of Knole. It is also an introduction to the people who've lived at Knole. The characters of the who inhabit the pages of this book, from Thomas Sackville, the grave Elizabethan statesman, to the dark-hearted Mortimer, who caused 3 nights of rioting in 1884 by closing the park to visitors, are all representative of their age. They open a window onto English history. They are also all members of a family, my family, described by the writer Vita Sackville-West as a race too prodigal, too amorous, too weak, too indolent, and too melancholy. In short, she concluded, a rotten lot, and nearly all stark staring mad. One of the pleasures of living at Knole is the opportunity to hang and rehang pictures, to reintroduce characters who would not necessarily have felt at ease beside each other at the time. Here, in the passage that leads to our private apartments, hang a couple with their eyes averted. Richard Sackville, 3rd Earl of Dorset, and his wife, Anne. Around the time these portraits were painted, they were on the verge of separating. Anne kept a diary of her miserable time at Knole, where she lost 3 infant sons in as many years, while her husband gallivanted around the country. The diary provides an intimate account of everyday life at Knole in the early years of the 17th century. Also in our private apartments is this wonderful double portrait of 2 brothers, painted 5 years before the outbreak of the English Civil War. The boy on the right, the 13-year-old Edward, gazes at the world with confidence. In October 1645, he was taken prisoner by parliamentary soldiers just outside Oxford and was then stabbed to death in cold blood by one of his captors. For the past 300 years, the family dining room has been located just behind a door at the foot of the great staircase. It's ours today, and many of the portraits on the walls have hung here for almost as long, including these ones. Sir Godfrey Kneller's portrait of Charles Sackville, 6th Earl of Dorset, captures that combination of rakishness and refinement that was so typical of the Restoration era. Charles was a close friend of King Charles II, who got him off 2 criminal charges, one for manslaughter and the other for exposing himself to the populace in very indecent postures, according to the diarist Samuel Pepys, from the balcony of a brothel in Covent Garden. As he grew older, however, Charles settled down, and his material contribution to the inheritance is as significant as any Sackville's since Thomas, the 1st Earl of Dorset. It is thanks to him that Knole acquired its unique collection of furniture. The restoration of King Charles II to the throne in 1660 coincided with the restoration of Knole. Knole had been ransacked by parliamentary troops in the 1640s and its contents dispersed. But during the last 15 years of Charles Sackville's life, it began to fill up again. Some of the collection came from his mother, Frances Cranfield's inheritance, including the 17th century silver furniture, mirrors, tables, torchairs, jars in the King's Room. most similar items made in England around this time was subsequently melted down. The silver furniture at Knole is a rare survival. The other source of the sixth Earl's collection was the royal palaces. Charles was appointed Lord Chamberlain of King William III's household, where his job was to supervise the domestic affairs of the monarch. One of the traditional perquisites or perks of office was to dispose of furniture from the royal palaces, particularly Whitehall, Hampton Court, and Kensington Palace, when it was felt to be out of date, on the death of a sovereign or on the change of a regime. And this is how Charles Sackville acquired for Knole one of the finest collections of Royal Stuart furniture in the world. Here we have the bed in the King's Room, made to celebrate the marriage of the future King James II to Mary of Modena in 1673. Or take a look at the bed in the Venetian ambassador's room. This bed was made for King James II at the end of his reign and used to be in Whitehall Palace. The items acquired from the royal palaces ranged from the magnificent to the mundane and include a royal close stool or commode and the brass locks in the cartoon gallery that bear King William III's monogram. It is Charles's collection, which began as an almost casual acquisition of cast-off furniture, that has come to define the house today. That special feel Knole has, that and has had for over 300 years, that fading magnificence, that luster dates from the 1690s and early 1700s. Knole was perhaps at its most magnificent during the first half of the 18th century, as the Sackville family continued its rise in fortune. When Lionel, the first Duke of Dorset, brought his young bride, Elizabeth Collier, to Knole in 1709, he initiated the first improvements in 100 years or so. He turned Knole into a place for a party. The staterooms were adapted to suit the social requirements of the 18th century assembly. Thomas Sackville's great chamber was turned into a ballroom. Here is Lionel as a young boy stroking a deer in a double portrait with his sister Mary. The portrait by Kneller hangs in the ballroom above a gilt table laden with magnificent Georgian silver candelabra and wine coolers. And here's a portrait of his future bride, Elizabeth Collier, beside an ornate gilt sconce bearing the Duke's coronet and garter, also in the ballroom. Next door to the ballroom was a withdrawing room, its walls swathed in crimson velvet known as kaffoy. The opulent wall hanging provided a perfect background for portraits such as this one. This is a portrait by Thomas Gainsborough of Lionel's favourite youngest son, George. Lord George was one of the ablest members the Sackville family has produced, and the one who came closest to achieving the highest office. He had the misfortune, however, to have been British Secretary of State for America during the American Revolution, and consequently shouldered much of the blame for the loss of the American colonies at the conclusion of the war in 1783. Most of the first Duke's changes, though, were focused on the family rooms on the ground floor. Here is a prospect or bird's eye view of Knole in the early 18th century, and here's the south and east corner of the house where we now live and where much of the refurbishment took place. A Huguenot designer called Mark Antony Hogeroy was commissioned to decorate the colonnade, which has to be one of the most beautiful rooms at Knole. In the 1720s, the room was glazed and its walls decorated with trompe-l'oeil arches and niches containing giant urns. Hogeroy was also commissioned to redecorate the second of Thomas Sackville's Jacobean staircases, connecting the colonnade on the ground floor to the ballroom on the first floor. Whereas Hogeroy painted over the lower flight with grisaille trophies of weapons and the Duke's coats of arms. The top flight, leading to the attics, which are little visited, still preserves its original Jacobean decorative scheme. That's one of the things I try to emphasize in my tours and in this book, the connection between the public and the private, between what you can see and what you can't, because it's only by viewing the house and its collection as a whole that you can really begin to understand Knole. In the first Duke's makeover, an enfilade of rooms designed for entertaining connected the foot of the second painted staircase to a suite of garden-facing rooms, an armory, a boudoir, a music room, and a library. Rooms that now comprise our private apartments. A library was fitted out for the first time to display the Duke's culture and refinement. It was furnished with the sort of book collection that befitted an 18th century gentleman. My previous books on Knole have stressed the power Knole has had over the people and who've lived there and their relationships. This book, on the other hand, celebrates what the people have done for the house, what they have wanted the house and the collection to say about themselves. There's a letter from the political theorist Edmund Burke that still resonates today. Declining an invitation to Knole in 1791, Burke wrote to the third Duke of Dorset, "I, who am something of a lover of all antiquities, must be a very great admirer of Knole. I think it is the most interesting thing in England. It is pleasant to have preserved in one place the succession of the several tastes of ages, a pleasant habitation for the time, a grand repository of what has been pleasant at all times." Edmund Burke was right. Knole really is a grand repository. And much of that is due to the first Duke's grandson, John Frederick Sackville. The third Duke was the only member of the Sackville family to create an art collection of his own. In 1770, like countless other young 18th century aristocrats, he embarked on a grand tour of Italy, shopping for classical statues and old master paintings. The third Duke was also a patron of contemporary painters such as John Hoppner and Thomas Gainsborough. His particular favorite, though, was Sir Joshua Reynolds. This portrait of Huang Yadong, as this young Chinese man is known, hangs above a self-portrait of Reynolds. And it is a personal favorite of mine, this particular portrait. Particular works of art would have had a greater prominence then than they do now for emotional as well as aesthetic reasons. Light filters through the leaded windows at the foot of the great staircase, playing over the life-size plaster figure of a woman reclining voluptuously. A good friend of the family is how, as children, we heard her described by the guides at Knole. This good friend was, in fact, a celebrated Italian ballerina, and the mistress of the third Duke. La Bacelli, as she was known, had caught his eye when dancing at the King's Theatre in London. By 1779, she was living at Knole, where she bore the Duke an illegitimate son. 20 years later, the Duke had married an heiress, and Bacelli had been pensioned off. Her naked statue was banished to the attics, where she spent the following century gathering dust before being returned to a place of prominence. Bacelli's spell still lingers on in the sunny suite of rooms in the private apartments on the south front. Here she can be glimpsed through the doorway leading from the almondry to the boudoir in a portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds. When I take people around the house, it's the attics and those behind-the-scenes areas that tend to capture their imagination and help them get beneath the skin of the place. Knole is an absolute labyrinth. It takes a long time to walk from one end to the other, and the main routes meander through a series of lobbies and come to sudden stops at dead ends. On the way, you encounter the most unexpected juxtapositions. An 18th century fire engine here, a range of cobwebbed classical busts there, a corridor known as Tapestry Passage where First World War military uniforms and cavalry boots tumble out of cupboards. Files of laudanum, literally, lurk in Victorian medicine chests, and love letters for another age curl on a windowsill. It's the junk, the bits and pieces that people could never bring themselves to throw away, that reveal almost as much about the past as Knole's unrivaled collection of Stuart furniture. In a storeroom off the stable yard is a rocking horse, traditionally assumed to have belonged to the fourth Duke. It's been passed down through generations of children at Knole, including Vita Sackville-West, and serves as a poignant reminder of the fourth Duke's short life, and as an eerie premonition of his death in a riding accident within 3 months of his 21st birthday. At the same time as the Sackville family ran out of heirs on the fourth Duke's death, the family also ran out of money. For the Sackville family has never been quite rich enough for the size of their house, which is why substantial rebuilding and collecting stopped in the 19th century. Parts of Knole began to look fairly dilapidated, although there was a brief flowering towards the end of the 19th century when Vita Sackville-West's mother, Victoria, moved in. Victoria was a woman of massive energy. She set about making Knole more comfortable. Central heating was introduced, and the house was fully electrified in 1902 with ornate brass light fittings that are still in use. The French artist Carolus Duran painted Victoria at Knole in 1906. A handsome woman, she stares confidently at the viewer. At the age of 43, Victoria reveals none of the weariness and disappointment that she confided to her diary. According to her, Carolus Duran thought it one of the best portraits he's ever painted. But she preferred it when people said that it didn't do her justice. Victoria also boasted that everyone says that I made Knole the most comfortable large house in England, uniting the beauties of Windsor Castle with the comforts of the Ritz, and I never spoiled the old character of Knole. By the turn of the century, Knole was certainly a magnificent place to enjoy a lavish weekend house party. From the living room on the south front, guests could flow through French windows out into the garden. In this photograph of a visit made by the Prince and Princess of Wales to Knole in July 1898, there's the Prince of Wales, there's the Princess of Wales holding the 6-year-old Vita. Sackville-West is holding Princess Alexandra's hand while her mother, Victoria, looks nervously on. The invitations and visitors' books now in the library from this time are a roll call of the rich and famous. The guest list for 3rd of July 1899 included the businessman William Waldorf Astor, who, as you can see, left a poem in praise of Knole in the visitor's book. He was later to fall in love with Victoria, as indeed was John Pierpont Morgan. But the show of wealth was in part a facade. Neither Vita nor Victoria inherited Knole. The title and the house were entailed to pass through the male line to her father's younger brother, Charles, and then to her cousin, the writer and music critic, Eddie Sackville-West. From the mid-1920s, Eddie had a suite of rooms in the Gatehouse Tower at Knole. Eddie's artistic influences bring a new dimension to the interior decoration at Knole. The decadence of the 1890s and a fascination with the macabre, as well as the modernism of the 1920s and the Bloomsbury aesthetic. And here is a plaster life mask of Eddie, cast from a wax mold that had been applied to his face as he breathed through a straw. It's mounted onto the wall of the spiral staircase that leads to his rooms in the Gatehouse Tower. Eddie's rooms are characterized by bright colors, pinks, sage greens, mustard yellow, deep blue. They are furnished with objects produced by his lovers, including a fire screen by Duncan Grant, and this cupboard shown here, painted by the artist John Banting. The period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second was hard for the country house. Many houses were pulled down, and their features, paneling, staircases, fireplaces, and so on, were sold off to builders and architectural scrap merchants. The Second World War finally brought an end to this era of country house living, as the First World War had threatened. Eddie moved out of his apartments at Knole, and in 1946, the Sackville family finally handed the house over to the National Trust with an endowment towards its maintenance. The family were granted a 200-year lease on large areas of the house and garden, and as a result, I'm the 13th generation of Sackvilles over the course of 400 years to live at Knole. Between 1945 and 1955, hundreds of country houses in England were demolished at the rate of up to one a week. The surrender of Knole to the National Trust guaranteed its survival, and over the next 60 years, the National Trust spent millions on the house and its contents. But by the turn of the millennium, there was still a lot to be done, until the recent works, damp pervaded Knole, as you can see from the condensation on the painted staircase. Here, overexposure to light rots the beautiful material on the spangle bed. Throughout the house, there were infestations of deathwatch beetle and woodworm. It became essential to repair and conserve those artworks and textiles for which Knole was so well known. a site for a conservation studio, was found in a restored medieval barn at Knole, which had been badly damaged in a fire of 1887. Thanks again to the Royal Oak, work will continue on the collection in perpetuity, not just on items from Knole, but also on items from other collections around the country. The studio has become a centre of excellence, training a new generation in these heritage crafts. Here is work on the famous Knole settee, a 17th century sofa that has inspired thousands of copies around the world, including one I saw recently, in fact, at Biltmore, the Vanderbilt mansion in North Carolina. But before any of these disintegrating treasures were restored, it was necessary to ensure that the environment to which they would be returned was stable, to restore Knole's crumbling fabric, to make its roofs, walls, and windows weatherproof. At the same time, my wife and I were debating whether to move with our 3 children into a wing of Knole. Was it possible, we asked ourselves, to make a mark on a house you'll never own, to carve a space for yourself in the corner of a 16th century mansion, to celebrate a present that is not overwhelmed by the past? We decided to give it a go. Together with the National Trust, we realized that a window of opportunity had opened between the generations, a moment when our need for a refurbishment coincided with the National Trust's desire to celebrate Knole a little bit more, to give it the prominence it deserved, to unlock the potential of this great treasure house. That is why the National Trust embarked on a program to restore Knole, its most significant transformation since Thomas Sackville remodeled the house 400 years ago. In the process, much more of the house was made accessible, including parts that add a whole new dimension to a visit to Knole. Here is the Prince of Wales, now King Charles, on a visit to Knole while he was president of the National Trust. He's in conversation with our youngest daughter, Edie, while her older sister, Freya, looks on. Here is an example of what the transformation has made possible. The orangery is one of the most beautiful rooms in the house, and yet, until a few years ago, it was a mess. Our gardeners parked their lawnmowers there, bedded out their plants, stored bits and pieces of machinery. It had become perhaps the grandest setting for a junk room in the south of England. It is now a warm and welcoming space, the first impression, in fact, that visitors get of Knole, a touch of the early 19th century Gothic revival style in what is predominantly a 17th century show house. Or take the Retainers Gallery on the second floor at Knole. This 17th century gallery had for the last 300 years been left unoccupied, serving as a large furniture store. Now you can see the gallery in all its restored magnificence with its decorated plaster ceiling. Around the same time as we were moving into Knole, I was writing a book called Inheritance, the story of Knole and the Sackvilles. I followed this up with another, The Disinherited, a story of family love and betrayal, which chronicled the struggles of an illegitimate branch of the Sackville family and their battle for Knole at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And after that, I vowed that I was done with books on Knole and the Sackville family, with one exception. I'd wrestled throughout the writing of Inheritance with the challenge of how to capture the smouldering spirit of the place. How much easier, I thought, would this be to do in pictures as well as words. The publishers, Rizzoli, put me in touch with the designer and photographer Ashley Hicks, who was fresh from producing a book on Buckingham Palace. Ashley spent entire days roaming the place. He brought this sleeping beauty back to life. He had the run of both the public rooms and the private apartments, from the cellars to the attics. Here, for example, is the French library at the heart of our home in the South Wing, where, like previous generations of Sackvilles, we have been trying to create a domestic environment in a Jacobean palace. I hope that you'll agree that Ashley has captured what Edmund Burke described as the successive taste of ages, that his photographs splendidly illustrate the evolving architectural and decorative features of the house, from Archbishop's Palace to Edwardian country house to show house and family home today, and that they are completely true to the spirit and magic of the place. Here is the southeastern corner of the house, seen in all its restored glory. It's a view of Knole rather like the one described in Virginia Woolf's Orlando. There it lay in the early sunshine of spring. It looked a town rather than a house. Here was a chapel, there a belfry. Spaces of the greenest grass lay in between. Here have lived, for more centuries than I can count, the obscure generations of my own obscure family. Not one of these Richards, Johns, Annes, Elizabeths has left a token of himself behind, yet all working together with their spades and their needles, their lovemaking and their childbearing have left this. I particularly like this passage, capturing, as it does, the essence of the house in which I was born and where I was brought up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Sackville. Can you hear me? A little bit? A little bit. I'll try to be loud. There we go. So we have time for a few questions. Thank you so much, Lord Sackville. That was fascinating. Do we have questions? Please use the microphones which Maggie and Kristen have. Yes. I'll tell you what, you can use mine.
So where did the money come to build this in the first place? And the surrounding countryside clearly must have had workers. Are there still workers? What's happening with the current property?
Okay, in answer to the first question, the money came from, I explained that Thomas Sackville, he was an Elizabethan and Tudor statesman. He was Lord Treasurer, so he was the chief financial officer for the country. And in those days, this was a massive opportunity for bribes and backhanders, basically. He became phenomenally rich, as indeed did all Lord Treasurers at the time. So that was the source of the original money. Now, the second question about the estate today. I mean, the National Trust are responsible for and are responsible for managing, showing, and interpreting the house. But the family, in terms of the deal that was made in 1946, still retain control over large areas of the house and continue to own the estate, including the park surrounding it. So the 1,000-acre deer park which is open to the public, I mean, every day, 24/7, is owned and cared for by the family.
Question right here.
What is the lovely golden stone that everything was built with? And I assume it was quarried locally, that it's all...
The stone, most of the stone you see in this photograph, for example, is a local stone known as Kentish ragstone. And so most of when Knole was originally built, in fact by the archbishops and before, there would have been stone pits all around that would have been quarried for the house.
Sorry, if you could use, excuse me, if you could use the microphone right here. Thank you.
I have a loud voice. Sorry. What is the number of staff that you have typically to keep the entire state running properly?
I think probably the National Trust for showing the house and housekeeping and visitor interpretation have about 40-ish full-time equivalent staff and up to 500 volunteers, although that is, you know, people who may do 1 or 2 hours a week. And Knole Estates, with core staff actually on the property and subcontractors and so on, probably about 10, 15.
Another question over here.
What portion of the house or the structure is heated in the winter?
Well, it is an extremely cold house, as you can imagine, and has always been. Our bit, I'm glad to say, does have central heating and has had since about 1900 when Victoria installed it, and so successive. So, but the showrooms have sort of conservation heating, you know, under the floors, but of a sort of don't keep them warm, but they keep them just at a level that preserves the contents. But overall, I would say about a third of the house, between a third and a half, has some form of proper heating.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
Could you please speak about the landscape design and the history of the landscape design and any landscape designers who we might know?
Well, the thing about Knole is but as I was saying earlier, the family never really had enough money. So one of the great pluses, I think, of that is that had the Sackville family had a massive amount of money in the 18th century, they would probably have pulled down large areas of the house and completely re-landscaped the park. But since they couldn't afford, you know, either an 18th century architect or a capability Brown, actually the landscape is pretty organic, and there are you know, a couple of avenues of trees planted, let's say in the 18th century in the park, but most of the park is not that different from what it would have been when it was a Tudor deer park in the 16th century. So despite the fact that the association of Vita Sackville-West, this noted garden expert of the 1930s, 40s, despite her association with Knole, she created Sissinghurst, but she didn't actually have any impact on the garden or park at Knole. And there have been very few instances of, you know, of whole-scale landscape or garden design at Knole.
One final question right here.
Do you have any kind of agreement with the moles?
What, with the moles? Because you see little evidence of them here. No, it's a good question, and I don't think we have had much trouble with them.
One final question. Can you visit this wonderful place, and if so, how?
Oh, well, yes, it's open. Bits of Knole are open 363 days a year. The park is always open, day and night, every day. The house, it's about 30 miles from London, half an hour in a train, and it's great. Go.
And if anyone has any final questions, I'm sure Lord Sackville will be happy to answer them while you purchase a book in the back of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Lord
you.
Robert Sackville. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us tonight. We hope to see you Monday for our program with Robert Andrews and General David Petraeus. Thank you. Have a wonderful night.